So what we end up with is that since A's reference of B is not the same as B's reference of itself, if you will, there exists an A and a B relative to A and a B. So what we end up with is that A's reference, the symbol, we're going to let this sideways triangle symbolize a referencing of, so this is A's reference of B. So A's reference of B does not equal B's reference of B. B's reference of A does not equal A's reference of A. So over here, this is the objective frame of reference of A's reference of B. And here is the subjective frame of reference of B's reference of B. However, we're going to go ahead and double these. A's reference of B not equaling B's reference of B. The same thing for B's reference of A not equaling A's reference of A. And we're going to make these relative to both A and B. So we're going to use the concept of relative frames of reference. So let's go ahead and redraw that. So having doubled up the reference frames as we have them over here, we're going to do this to compensate for relative frames of reference. That being A's reference of B relative to A, A's reference of B relative to B. I use the component on the outside of the brackets on the right-hand side to distinguish between my use of relative to versus something being a function. So when you see me using A or B or some other number in relation to the, or some other variable or constant or number in relation to the existics equations, what I mean is relative to. So this is A's reference of B relative to A, A's reference of B relative to B, B's reference of A relative to A, B's reference of A relative to B, B's reference of B relative to A, B's reference of B relative to B, B's reference of B, or whoops, A's reference of A relative to A, and A's reference of A relative to B. As you can see, this thing starts to become sort of a mind twist because we're flipping around, going back and forth with relative this and that to the other and so on and so forth. And as you're going to see, this is going to get a little bit more complicated, but it then becomes very simple, and that's where we're going. So basically, these are relative frames of reference, so we could kind of draw in for that. So here's A's reference of B relative to A, A's reference of B relative to B. There's B's reference of A relative to A, B's reference of A relative to B, A's reference of A relative to A, A's reference of A relative to B, and B's reference of B relative to A, and B's reference of B relative to A, or however if I screwed that up. Going back to the analogy between my great-grandmother and myself, where she was saying that time seemed to go by so fast for her in her 90s that she could see grass grow, and given that I then at 16 and still now at 36 cannot see grass growing, what that infers is that she and I, her and I, are having the same experience separately. Her experience is happening faster than mine relative to me, and mine is happening slower than hers relative to her. So basically, if let's say this is me and this is my great-grandmother and we were having that conversation, since time goes by faster for her and slower for me, she's further along in the conversation than I am, and I'm further behind her in the conversation than she is. Therefore, there's two conversations happening between me and my great-grandmother, one relative to her and one relative to me, and that is beautifully accounted for in separate and distinct frames of reference. All we need is to create a coordinate system with an invariance whereby we can link the two together. And that's basically where we're going with this. So we've got two A's here, right? We've got two B's. I'm going to use a different color of chalk to make this a little bit more illustratable. Right? They're sort of like, there's the other B. Here's the other A. And one of them is A relative to A, one of them is A relative to B, one of them is B relative to B, and one of them is B relative to A. So we'll go ahead and go A relative to A, and A relative to B. And then we have B relative to B, and B relative to A. A relative to A and A relative to B do not equal each other. B relative to B and B relative to A do not equal each other. So they are not the same and they are not the same. So A relative to itself is not the same as any other A relative to any other B, and B is not the same as any other B relative to any other A. So what does that mean? Well, that means that for all things, that thing relative to itself is not the same as that thing is relative to any other thing, and vice versa. What we can now do is take concept of reference frame, A reference of B, B reference of A, so on and so forth, and relative frames of reference, and go ahead and put these together and form a schemata. We can therefore define A and B in terms of relative frames of reference pertaining to A and B. A can be defined as A relative to A and A relative to B. A relative to A and A relative to B can be broken down further into subjective and objective frames of reference, such as A's reference of A relative to A, B's reference of A relative to A, those being subsequent subjective and objective frames of reference relative to A. In order to completely define A, we must define B.